Okay, we're going live now. Good afternoon, or I guess good evening, everybody. My name is Mr. Waldrop. I have been a U.S. history teacher, and I am a social studies teacher. I'm currently teaching physics at the school, but I was asked to do a live stream to help students at Denham Springs High School get ready for the U.S. History LEAP test. Of course, anybody can use this video to learn a little bit about U.S. history or to just get ready for the LEAP test. And the person that asked me to do this is somebody who's here with me, and this is Mr. Ray.
Howdy, I'm Mr. Ray. I did this as a way to help you and any U.S. history student review for the LEAP exam. Basically, what's going to happen is we're going to go through a set of images and political cartoons that me and Mr. Waldrop came up with that we thought would probably be on your LEAP test in some way, shape, or form. Each of them are going to go through topics. If I remember correctly, this particular episode is going to start with Manifest Destiny and westward expansion and end with the Progressive Era, or Imperialism. My apologies. So, without further ado, are you ready?
I am ready. And as we go through these videos, or through these images, I think it serves as a double purpose. So the first one is it gives us visual cues to kind of tell us what exactly we need to make sure we cover. But it also functions in a large sense of being able to provide you with those political cartoons and those visual documents to help you. Some of these you may actually see in the LEAP test. As we go through, we'll try to do our best, from my own recollection, to tell you ones that I think you need to be careful for. Some of these images are just visual cues for us, but it's still good visual cues for you following along. But it's not necessarily images that I would expect to see on a LEAP test. So we're going to start off right now, going right into it, and we're going to start off with our LEAP review with Manifest Destiny. Of course, this is a very famous image. The name of the image is, in fact, Manifest Destiny. One of the things you will notice about this image is there's a lot going on here. Of course, you've got this angel of the Lord type situation, kind of showing she is blessing the white settlers, right? Of course, you can look over here. Of course, the sky is bright and happy. But I want everybody to take a look over here. This is the Native American area over here. Of course, you can see it's dark and it looks savage. So it's really showing she's kind of bringing the light of technology. Of course, she's bringing the power cable and the trains following her. Agriculture's coming. And, of course, you can see in the background you've got, predominantly advanced civilization and cities. And so it really kind of shows, obviously it's got a kind of a pro-westward expansion slant to it, steeped with elements of kind of racism built into it. That these Native Americans are dumb, savage people. And it really kind of shows not only the fact that how they view Native Americans, but it kind of also in a way is going about almost justifying, if you will, the whole situation of justifying why they're doing westward expansion, right? Anything you want to add to that, Mr. Ryan?
I think you nailed it. One thing I did want to kind of notice, I got some notes here, pardon me. One of the particular innovations that I wanted to take a look at was she's carrying telegraph wires, okay? If you remember, Alexander Graham Bell was the inventor of the telegram. The telegram was one of the first things that was able to connect the United States coast to coast besides the railroads. We'll get into the telegram a little bit later. I'm pretty sure I have that somewhere on this slideshow, but that's something I did want to point out. And then I think that did it. Yeah, you covered the native peoples and animals being pushed into the darkness. Yeah, that was excellent.
All right. Okay, so California Gold Rush is really a fascinating thing, right? So whenever we think of the California Gold Rush, we think about this era in which all these people are migrating westward. And they're all migrating westward for the same basic purpose, which is in search of gold. Now, the whole thing about being a 49er, of course, that's the term you would look for on the test. This whole thing about being a 49er is this belief that in 1849 there was gold out west, and it was something worth crossing the country for.
Right.
The funny thing about that, though, is it's kind of almost as a derogatory term. You see, by 1849, all the gold's gone. And so what's happening is in 1849, all these cities are having their infrastructure just upheavaled with all this additional population, right? So if you were somebody living out west in the mid-1800s, it'd be very common to have somebody say, oh, these 49ers, as a way to kind of almost be a derogatory term for people moving out west. Of course, this is associated with the California Gold Rush. This is, again, by the way, the Manifest Destiny, that could be an image you could find on the leak test. I don't think you'll see this one. This is more just a
way for us to tell you.
A visual clue.
Correct,
right?
correct.
This is representative of the Homestead Act. I don't think you're going to see this image on the test, but you do need to kind of understand this concept. And the Homestead Act is one of those acts that really just drives westward expansion. It's the one that allows all this free land out west for any settler to just come and take over.
One thing that I did see was this was extremely discriminatory towards Native American land, right? Native Americans believe land belonged to the community and not to individuals.
Right.
They didn't really believe in the idea of purchasing land like we kind of do today. They didn't own land the way that homesteaders conceived ownership. That conceptual difference is going to kind of bring about conflict later on the westward side of the United States. We'll talk about that a little bit later with Ghost Dance and Wounded Knee.
Right.
But this is going to start the period of conflict with Native Americans once again, and it won't be the last time, I think.
Right. Well. And one last thing to point out, too, is the Homestead Act was steeped with all this basic thing. The purpose of it was to create sellable land to try to encourage, well, not sellable, claimable land to encourage this westward expansion and also to help encourage the building of the railroad. Okay, so as they begin moving west, right, people are starting to move west, you're starting to see this major conflict with Native Americans, right? Now, the Native Americans are also already going to be pushed off on the reservations. And enters a Theodore Dawes who is going to come along and he's going to kind of create this whole thing where, you know, as you were talking about, they view it as communal land.
Correct.
So what he does is he comes along and he says, why don't we take these reservations and say, okay, the Native American tribe itself can no longer claim this land. What they have to do is they have to come and claim individual allotments. And, you know, you go to say to a Native American, hey, you need to claim this plot of land. And, of course, the Native Americans are going to say, well, what's a plot of land?
Right.
Right? So he creates this additional conflict where massive chunks of the Native American lands is just completely ripped away from them.
Right. That's kind of what the cartoon is getting at. Dawes is chomping up Native American land. You can see his teeth look sharp. Basically, the cartoon is trying to imply that the Dawes Act was almost discriminatory towards Native Americans, right? As he mentioned, they don't view it as property. It's more of a communal idea. So the fact that Dawes is even coming through and doing this kind of thing is highly offensive to Native Americans.
That's right. Okay. Again, not an image I would expect to see on the leak test either. You might see this image on the leak test. There's several others that are like it. And, of course, this kind of represents the Trail of Tears. Now, in my class, we kind of talk about the Indian Relocation Act. Of course, you know, I kind of use that that back and forth with that Senator Edward Everett, where you can see him and Andrew Jackson kind of going at it.
Right.
And, of course, at the time, they were like, oh, this is going to be a great act. And, of course, I gave the dissenting opinion, where he says they're going to look back on this with great remorse over what has happened. Of course, today we don't think of it as Indian Relocation Act. We think of it as the Trail of Tears. Right? But this is where Native Americans are forced off their land and onto reservations.
We went into the Trail of Tears. It wasn't something that we jumped and delved into a lot. But basically the premise of it is they wanted to create these reservations where they could put Native American people specifically, and they wouldn't have to be in the way, quote unquote. That's not exactly the verbiage Andrew Jackson put it, but that's pretty much what he was getting at. The issue is that as we enter into the late 19th century, even though they put them on those reservations in the first place, they start to think that they're in the way once again. So that's going to bring up a lot more conflict. The whole goal behind post-Indian Relocation Act or Trail of Tears Native American interaction is assimilation, which they want them to kind of integrate into American culture and become more American versus being more Native American. Right. So we're going to see that pop up here in a second, I think with the next image, if I'm not mistaken.
All right, let's take a look here.
Yes.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is this is Indian Chief Wakova. Now, he's a shaman of the Northern Peyote tribe, and this is a situation where the Native Americans are really starting to dwindle. They've had their land chopped up through the Dawes Act, the reservations they had chopped up, and they're starting to get to a point where they're really starting to fear for their cultural heritage, all that stuff. So they decide to kind of make one last giant super tribe, and they start creating new cultural practices, right? Try to kind of promote that new things are going on, right? That their best days are not necessarily behind them. And this kind of stirs up pride in Native American culture.
Correct.
But in doing so, it also kind of spooks the locals, if you will. And this is going to kind of lead to some confrontations. It's going to be kind of a saving grace moment, for, if you will, for a moment for the Native Americans, as they have a couple big victories, right? Like the victory at the Alamo, for example. So it's going to be some of these great big victories that's going to kind of restore pride in the Native Americans.
Absolutely. Yeah, the in my notes here that I have, it's basically a practice of a dance that they would believe that would reunite the living with the spirits of the dead. They would bring the spirits to fight on their behalf. Their goal was to try and stop westward expansion. I don't think they quite achieved that, as you can kind of tell. And bring peace, prosperity, and unity to Native American peoples throughout the region. And as Mr. Waldrop was kind of saying, it was one last hurrah for the Native Americans and their culture, right?
Right. And of course, it all comes to a crescendo. Now, you're probably not going to see this image on the leak test, but this is an actual image of Wounded Knee. So what happens is, the locals get really spooked, and they decide they've had enough, and they kind of come in and decide to lay waste to the Native Americans, the last gasp, if you will. Now, you'll see this often referred to as the kind of unofficial end of the Indian Wars. It's just a massacre, right? I mean, this is, I refer to as the massacre at Wounded Knee. And, of course, the basic end of this is they come in and they just absolutely wholesale slaughter every man, woman, and child they can find. Of course, again, children, women are killed. The whole situation goes on. And kind of one of the saddest parts of it, too, is the guys that come in and slaughter all of them, even the innocents. They're not punished for it. They're given badges, awards.
Yeah.
So it's really kind of a moment where the nation's celebrating this.
It's a testament to truly how the American government and the American military felt about Native Americans. There was no sense of remorse. There was no sense of regard for their feelings and their land and their tribe and their culture. It was just an all-out savage slaughter, as Mr. Waldrop was kind of saying.
Quite the blemish. But again, I wouldn't expect to see this image, but you could see this topic. And of course, what is left of the Native Americans begins what you're talking about, the assimilation, right? This is an image of an Indian school. Of course, you can see this is the same guy on the left and the right.
Yes.
And of course, he's forced to give up all his cultural identity, everything that makes him unique. Their language was stripped from them. And this is, of course, an example of like the Carlisle School, and so on and so forth. Of course, here's another good image. Of course, these are the same children. By the way, shout out to Joseph. I just thought I'd give him a shout out. Anyway, so these are the Native Americans at the Carlisle Indian School. And of course, you can see the before and after as they've been completely stripped away from their cultural identity. You could see an image like one of these. In fact, it's probably going to be one of these two images. But it's definitely going to be one that shows the kind of before and after.
Yeah, I was reading an article on this the other day because this is something that I was kind of interested in, actually, just reading around. And They operated for nearly 30 years, and the mission of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, that's the name of the school, by the way, their mission was to kill the Indian and save the man. Okay, they wanted to completely destroy Native American culture and to integrate them into Western culture. Of course, that goes with a variety of aspects. That goes with clothing. That goes with language, because remember, most Native Americans had their own tribal language. So they wanted them to get them to speak English. They wanted them to dress like them. They wanted to adopt the same religion, the same ideas, the same philosophies. Absolutely, yes,
that's a great one.
They wanted them to shift from their classic, what the Westerners or Americans thought as barbaric, traditional, animist Native American religion. They wanted them to shift towards Christianity, okay, and kind of push that towards them. So that's the whole purpose of this school.
Right. Okay, now, as you see people begin migrating out west, around this era, you're going to see a major shift in black America. Now, a lot of black people decide they too want to take advantage of this new frontier, right? From their standpoint, they're hoping to escape Jim Crow and the oppression of the South. One of the things I always tell my students whenever I go through this is, I don't want to get in conflict, because a lot of times I would have students go, why didn't they all move? Mm-hmm. Right? What black person wants to stay behind and face the oppression of Jim Crow? The dilemma that they had, though, is just because they're not facing the oppression of Jim Crow does not mean they're not facing oppression.
Period.
Now they're facing the oppression of Mother Nature.
Correct.
And often Mother Nature can be a cruel oppressor.
Yeah.
Because, they're at this weird, unique advantage where their crops grow just the same for them as they would their white counterparts. They're not necessarily going to get the ideal plots of land, but they're definitely going to be in a better situation where they can have access to land and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. But they're still dealing with problems of drought and famine and locusts and all the other things that come with the nightmare that is frontier life. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of a catch-22, right? Do you stay behind and face Jim Crow, or do you go out west and deal with Mother Nature?
The big thing about the West, too, is that it was so unknown. You guys have to remember, this is before most technology was out. I mean, nowadays we can look and see what's going on in the weather on the other side of the world in an instant, but it was kind of a big question mark as to what the West was. They didn't know if they were able to farm land. They didn't know if they were going to be able to build a life for themselves, or they can kind of live and prosper. So they might have had some hesitation there as well. That's why some of them stayed behind.
And of course, we all know why they might have left. And this is the rise of Jim Crow, right? The rise of the KKK. Following the Civil War, just because black people are free does not mean they're treated as equals.
Correct.
Yes, there is the 14th and 15th Amendments trying to give them their protections, but it's not being enforced in the South. One of the things I always tell students, and I was actually having a discussion with my wife the other day, we see this, for example, with speeding, right? Mm-hmm. So, you drive down the road and the speed limit is 65 miles an hour. And everybody's doing 70 miles an hour. They're all technically breaking the law, right? So why do they all do that? Well, it's because everybody that's driving down the road knows they're not going to pull me over and give me a ticket for going 5 miles an hour over the road. And it kind of brings up the point of laws are only important to the degree in which they are enforced.
Correct.
If there's a law in the books but it isn't enforced, then is it really even a law? I mean, technically it is, but if it's non-functional, it's kind of useless, right? And so we have quite a few laws like that, right? Like when you see, for example, cannabis being now quote-unquote legalized, it's still illegal at the federal level. Mm-hmm. It's just the federal government's decided not to enforce it.
Correct.
And then states decide whether or not to make it illegal at the local level. That's an example. I think speed limits are a good example for another one. Anything you want to add to this image?
Just kind of the name of the cartoon. It's the Union as it was, because one thing that my students struggle with a little bit is getting all of the imagery down in a political cartoon. Okay, and I know a lot of political cartoons can be a little bit overwhelming. So the main point behind the cartoon is, at the end of Reconstruction, there are these groups that emerge, like the KKK and the White League. You can tell by that guy on the right. That is an obvious KKK uniform.
Yeah.
And the guy on the left, he has a White League patch on his jacket. Their goal was to restore the Union to, quote-unquote, as it was, which is what the name of the cartoon was, before the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendment. Okay?
Right.
That's why you see that they're kind of holding and shaking hands, and under them they have a group of African-American or black people while their house is being burned down, and there's a skull and crossbones that rests above the seal there. So, yeah, just kind of wanted to add it on to the overall idea of the cartoon.
Okay, so following the events of westward expansion, you have these cattle kingdoms, right? Where people are going out west, and thus begins kind of the stereotypical cowboy, right? Now, the stereotypical cowboy is going to start running into some problems. There's two major problems that are going to kind of kill the cowboy. The first one, oddly enough, is barbed wire. Barbed wire is going to be this new invention that the Native Americans refer to it as the devil's rope. And it's really going to hurt the Native Americans who relied on free-ranging buffalo who now can't free-range anymore.
Right.
But the thing about barbed wire is it meant you no longer needed farmers on the farms, or at least not as many cowboys on the farm, to keep the cattle inside, right? It used to be like mostly wooden fences, and they fell apart fairly easily, and you needed a lot of cowboys. This is it's one of those, it doesn't completely kill the cowboy, but it dramatically reduces their usefulness. It also makes it really harder to drive steer to market if all the communal land is now roped off with barbed wire.
Correct.
So it's going to be a major variable in killing off the cowboy. And of course, the major thing that is the coup de grace is the railroad, right? Why would you pay a cowboy, $6,000 to get a steer to market when you can pay a few $100s on a train?
Load them up and drive.
Yeah, and instead of 2 months, it's 6 days.
Correct.
Instead of losing, a fourth of your cattle, you lose none. So it's safer, it's cheaper. And of course, the invention of the railroad mixed with the barbed wire kind of kills off your cowboy. One of the cautionary things I always kind of talk about when I get to this unit is automation's been doing this forever, right? We come up with new technology and certain jobs die, right? Nobody works at a Blockbuster anymore. We killed off video rental stores.
Don't need it.
We've kind of had this worry in the back of our minds of what happens when automated cars come along and it kills off the trucking industry. So it's a very common repeated theme throughout, particularly U.S. history, but all of history, of automation kind of killing off jobs.
Yeah, that's something we're seeing, and we're going to see here in our time. With the introduction of AI into our social sphere.
Right.
It's like, as Mr. Waldrop was kind of saying, it's a repeating theme.
Right.
Okay, and that's something you need to pay attention to, especially with the railroad, because the railroad alters it massively.
Yeah, it's funny. We're today, I was listening to a podcast talk about how the writers of movies are talking about going on strike because of the advent of, is it Chat
GPT or
GPT?
OpenAI?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So they're saying that, hey, we can use less writers and just have AI write the bulk of the script and just have one writer come along instead of a team of writers. So it's an interesting world, especially for a movie writer.
Yeah. That's such an odd concept, because that's like your entire livelihood. How are you supposed to function after that? Which you can kind of make that comparison to the cowboy. Once their entire livelihood is taken away, what do they do next? Where do they go? How do they function in a monetary-driven society? You just can't.
Well, and we always even act like we're immune to it. But one of the things I remember is when I was a kid and I used to do summer school, like I'd see summer school happen. It'd be one teacher, and she's teaching like 30 students, and there would be many, many teachers up on campus. Now you'll see one teacher, and they just got a room full of kids on the internet
watching a video.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter whether they're certified in the subject or not.
Yeah.
And now 2 or 3 teachers can do the work of what used to take 10, 15 teachers.
Yeah, that's a scary thought.
Automation
Automation is coming.
Yeah, it's hitting everybody. Now, when we talk about the railroad, we always have to talk about who built the railroad. And, of course, the railroad is really built, at least coming out of the West, in the backs of immigrants coming from China. Mm-hmm. Now, the Chinese people, by the way, I don't think you're going to see this image on the LEAP test, but you could see one similar to it. And, of course, they're kind of being tricked to come to America with the hopes of getting gold. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the problem is, if you check the date on this, this is the late 1800s. Of course, all the gold's been mined by 1849. Mm-hmm. So the people that are luring them out there, they're well aware there's no gold in their hills. Mm-hmm. They just want the cheap labor of the immigrants, right? Of course, this is dangerous work. They're basically sending these Chinese laborers up into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada and being told, hey, use this new invention called dynamite, which we've not perfected, and basically hope you don't blow yourself up trying to carve out the Sierra Nevada. And by the way, we know you're mostly from the southern region of China, which is a climate very similar to the south here in America. Go out into the Sierra Nevada where it's frozen over with basically coats, like very light coats. Mm-hmm. So when they're not blowing up, they're freezing to death.
And not to mention being paid very poorly as far as compensation goes for all of that.
All right. Often they're paid just enough to be able to buy stuff from the foreman's local store. Mm-hmm. So it's almost a form of indentured servitude.
Right, which is odd because in a modern society, a lot of the times the more dangerous jobs are the high-paying ones. Like underwater welders make a ridiculous amount of money, but it's because their job is so perilous. But at the same time, they're only being paid like that because they're immigrants.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, they have no legal protection.
Exactly, they have no legal protection. If they had someone that was from that area or from the United States that moved out there, they have to be paid somewhat a little bit more fairly, right?
Right. We see that today, too, with immigrants today, right? Correct. Like, you see a lot of immigrants that are going out there. Sometimes they're paid below minimum wage. Of course, they're paid under the table.
Right.
But they're not guaranteed any kind of quality of protection on the job. There's no limits to the hours they can work. They'll work overtime. They don't get paid overtime.
Yeah.
So it's a very similar thing where we've kind of treated illegal immigration is like a necessary evil for cheap labor. And the railroad would be no difference. Now, for them to go out of the Sierra Nevada and basically blow themselves up, you would think for their sacrifice they'd be beloved, but they're not.
No.
They're hated, right? And they're hated, and you can kind of somewhat understand if you were somebody who was a day laborer, the fact that they're driving down labor, right? If they're willing to work for half of what a, say, minimum wage was, it's going to create an impetus of people wanting to pay workers cheaper. Why would I pay you, say, for example, $12 an hour?
Whenever I can just pay this immigrant.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't have to worry about any of the protections.
Correct.
So they're seen by the locals as absolutely hated. Of course, you could see this one on there, and it basically says that, says, notice they don't like communists, nihilists, socialists, hoodlums, blah, blah, blah. So that Native Americans, not Native Americans, the Chinese immigrants are the worst of the worst. Of course, you can see this one at the bottom where it says the only one barred out, and that is the Chinese.
It's kind of a play on words on the idea of the American dream.
Right.
It's you're supposed to be able to come here and seek a better life for yourself, but there's only one group that's being excluded here.
Right.
As far as the cartoon goes, I think you hit it on the head whenever you're kind of, looking at different aspects of the cartoon and trying to find the meaning of the cartoon and how that kind of goes. Notice it says at the top, Golden Gate of Liberty. That's once again kind of showing, this is America. This is where you go to pursue a better life.
Yeah, that's certainly not a gate. That's a cast iron door.
That is a door locked. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, just wanted to pay attention to some of the aspects of the cartoon. You notice what the Chinese man has with him. On the left-hand side, it says industry. On the right-hand side, it says peace. And if I remember correctly... Sobriety.
Yeah. Order is the box he's sitting on.
Order is the box that he's sitting on. So it's not like they're coming into the United States and causing a bunch of trouble. Right. They're humble people. They just want to work and make money. Right. But for some reason, they're barred out of the United States.
That's right. And of course, there is a great deal of possible images you could see. This is another one. Of course, you got Uncle Sam. You see the racist overtones of how the Chinese immigrant is depicted. Of course, this one is the Chinese Anti-Exclusion Acts.
Yes.
This is another possible one you could see in the leap test. Again, Native the Americans, Chinese immigrants are seen almost as subhuman. This is another one you could see. Here's another one. Now, this one is fascinating, and this is the one I would probably say you could most likely see. And it kind of shows you that in the West, you got Chinese immigrants, but in the East, you have immigrants from Europe, particularly the Irish. And they're hated in the East also. And, of course, this kind of image basically says that, the problem is solved, let them eat each other, type thing. But it kind of shows how the Irish, of course, he's kind of dressed like a leprechaun. But they're hated as well. And, of course, what they're eating is Uncle Sam. Of course, it's another one showing that the problems they see that the Chinese immigrants are bringing in. This is one kind of showing the people that built the railroads in the East. Of course, these are immigrants and, of course, black people, too. Usually freedmen coming up north. One thing I want to talk about, though, is, in the West, there's a massive racial component to it, right? The hatred of Asians and Asians kind of coming and taking these jobs. In the East, the Irish are hated, but there's also a religious component to it as well. The average American, at least in, say, the Northeast, if you ever seen Gangs of New York, it does a great job.
Yeah, it's a great show.
But the average person in the Northeast is Protestant. And all these Catholics are coming in, and they're Catholic. And, Irish people coming in, they're Catholic. And it kind of creates a modern-day Protestant Reformation war.
Yes. Well, that continued into the late 20th century as well with the IRA stuff. And the 21st century, too. That Protestant versus Catholic feud starts pretty early in America, and it's not going to go away.
Right.
Especially, as Mr. Waldron mentioned, in the East.
Yeah, there was a scandal that JFK was a Catholic.
Yes, yeah.
So as the railroads start getting big, we start running into this problem where some of these guys are getting so big and so rich and powerful that they can start to put their thumb on the hands of government decisions. Kind of sound familiar, huh?
Yeah.
But it starts becoming a huge problem that the really rich and powerful are starting to control the country. We start kind of having these oligarchs that are running the country. Of course, you can see Standard Oil and all these monopoly men, these robber barons, if you will. And it kind of shows that they're the ones that are really the big dogs running the country.
Right.
And of course, you see Congress sitting there, kind of looking over their shoulder, trying to decide what they can do to make the big wigs, the fat cats, if you will, happy.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to note, we've got, this is as it's called in American history, it's the rise of industry in the United States. And it's not only the rise of industry because, technology is advancing at such a rapid rate. There is a very select group of individuals that are in control of this rise of industry, okay? One I wanted to point out, as he kind of mentioned earlier, is Standard Oil. As you might know, that's J.D. Rockefeller. J.D. Rockefeller controlled the Standard Oil Company, which was, believe it or not, the United States' first billion-dollar company ever created. All of this, to kind of give you an effect of it, all of this is going to lead to the Sherman Antitrust Act, which a lot of the trust-busting stuff doesn't come until the early 20th century with Theodore Roosevelt's presidency. But this is going to lead to a large amount of legislation and ultimately the progressive movement as well.
Right. And of course, you could see this image. It's possible. It's also possible you see this image. This is another one. Of course, you've got Vanderbilt over here with his railroad monopoly. This is another. By the way, Vanderbilt, we did in my class, I think you did in yours, the whole, are they robber barons, are they captains?
Yes, yeah.
Right? As a general rule, it's kind of seen as Vanderbilt is the quintessential robber baron. I mean, he's probably the one that is the easiest to go, yeah, it's a robber baron.
Well, a lot of my students, whenever I had them, I gave them the primary sources, and I was like, "Look, this is your decision. You're going to decide whether or not they're robber barons or captains of industry." And after about 20 minutes of them looking over the primary sources, I can remember one of my students in second hour raised his hand, and he goes, "Man, that Vanderbilt guy's real horrible, isn't he?" And I was like, "Yeah," talking about how he didn't give his workers off time and all of these other things, paid them very poorly. So yeah, I would say if there is a quintessential robber baron, it's got to be that guy.
Yeah.
Not to mention he's got bad facial hair.
Yeah, he's pretty ruthless. Of course, this kind of shows your robber barons, and they're kind of carving up. Particularly the railroad robber barons are carving up America into spheres of influence, if you will. So enters what will eventually become the populist movement, right? And it all begins with lonely farmers, right? You got your farm, you got a son, you got a daughter, and you're sitting there looking at yourself going, wait a minute, I better find somebody for my kids to marry. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want them to be stuck with the only other member of the opposite sex, their sibling, right? So they start creating these Granger organizations, right? Like the Patrons of Husbandry was one of the bigger ones. And it's this idea of like, we need to be able to start meeting up with other farmers, particularly our children, to kind of auction them off to each other, combine some farms maybe to make bigger, more powerful farms.
Right.
But the big one is to make sure that we find suitable heirs, suitable matches for our children. So it gives rise to these Granger organizations. Now, as these Granger organizations start to meet, they start noticing, wait a minute, we have a lot of common interests, right? And they start looking into it and saying, wait a minute, we have some of the same problems. And these Granger organizations are going to give rise to these farmers' alliances, right? The Grand Masons is a good one. Of course, that's their symbol that made it onto the dollar bill, right? Is that all sing out of the Grand Masons.
Yeah, the one thing I did want to point out about the Granger organizations and the eventual populist movement, their biggest gripe was monopolistic grain transport prices.
Right.
Okay, if you remember, the railroads are spreading out west and the Midwest as quickly as they can. Okay, at a rapid pace, and so the easiest way for you to get grain across the country was to ship it on a train because
it's almost the only way to do it.
It is pretty much the only way to do it at that point.
Yep.
Because, as you said, the killing of the cowboy and the killing of the buffalo is going to kill any kind of other form of transport.
Right.
So they're fighting these monopolistic grain prices where it's almost you're going into debt to ship your own product. And if you have any idea how a modern business works, you're not supposed to go into debt sending your stuff to stores. Like, do you think, let's just say Johnson & Johnson or Nabisco or Nestle or any of these large corporations that do food industry stuff are selling their product to Walmart, they're not going broke shipping it there on an 18-wheeler. You know what I mean? That's their big gripe is the monopolistic grain transport prices because these robber barons control the railroads and can spike the prices up to whatever they want it to be. So that's kind of where the whole root of the issue started.
Right. Right. So they give rise to these farmers' alliances. And by the way, that was the origin of "We Are Farmers." That was one example of one that we're all going to band together and get a group insurance rate going. Of course, now anybody can buy it. By the way, you're not going to see that image on the lead test.
Definitely not. Definitely.
But I thought it was funny. Now, as they get together, you're slowly going to start to see these farmers band together, and they begin to get political. Think of it almost like if you remember, like the Tea Party movement a little while ago, or the Occupy Wall Street movement, where it's not really a political party, it's more a collection of political ideas, right? And you're going to start seeing this populist movement. Of course, you may have heard it even as recently as, say, for example, with Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, where you kept hearing the news talk about they were really reaching out to that populist sentiment, right? Of course, the idea being creating policy to help the poorest working
Average,
class. Yeah,
correct.
the little guy.
As a matter of fact, the term populist is a Latin word for public or people. That's where all of that roots from. So it's very much centered around it's everyman focused, right?
Right.
So that's where it kind of comes from, and it just so happens that everyman focused in this time period is farmers.
Right.
It's the largest demographic.
Right. Well, for most of America's history, the largest manual labor class is going to be your farmers, right?
Correct.
I mean, we're an agricultural society, so that makes sense. Now, out of this is going to come the first populist candidate that really sees any traction. I think the best way I can really say this, and by the way, this is William Jennings Bryan.
WJB.
And he is going to kind of become the populist candidate while also at the same time taking over the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
So the Democrats are going to run him as their president. The best example I could think of this is in a modern day sense. It's almost kind of like how, and he didn't actually become the candidate, but out of that kind of a populist, very liberal, Occupy Wall Street movement, if you will, was Bernie Sanders. And I think most people would say there's a massive chasm between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden, or Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton.
Very
massive
wide
differences,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And only in the loosest of sense could you lump them together in the same party. But it's one of these things where the liberal aspect started to creep in and take over the Democratic Party. And to some extent, you could say the same thing about the Donald Trump kind of following on the piggyback of the Tea Party movement.
Correct.
You know, I mean, I don't think he came in and labeled himself as a Tea Party candidate.
Right, but a lot of his ideals kind of reflected that Tea Party movement.
Right. So it's one of those where he's not the conventional norm of the party at the time, but it piggybacks off a movement that kind of takes over the party and kind of eats it.
Right. One thing I did want to add is I always talk to my students about a political spectrum. Right? You have left to right, okay? You have, and all these little dots in between can be seen as different things and different ideals. These guys are pretty close to far left.
Right.
Fairly close, okay?
Yeah.
This is the most radical of the radical, quote unquote.
Right.
For the time period.
Right.
For the time period, at least.
And, of course, their main issue is bimetallism. Now, up until this point, the only currency in America is gold, right? And what they're hoping to do is to have gold and silver, right? They want both of these. What they're really looking to do is have the ability to have inflation. You see, we couldn't have inflation in that era. And I know it's easy to sit there and say, well, God, I don't want inflation. Inflation's terrible, right? But inflation has its advantages, particularly if you have debt.
Very good.
Right?
Yes,
a lot of these farmers are going into debt trying to buy the latest and greatest in technologies. These farm plows and the better seed and the better grain. Some of them are taking out loans to advance and kind of rebuild, barbed wire their fences and stuff like that. If you have debt, inflation is your buddy. A good example is like if you were somebody that is renting a house, the last thing on earth you want is inflation. It's killing you.
Yeah.
If you own your house and you're making a mortgage payment,
oh, it's fantastic.
if inflation goes up, that means your house's value goes up.
Correct.
Right? Like, I know that since the pandemic, we're paying for our house. If I were to have to rent my house today, it'd probably be $600-700 more a month.
Right.
So not only am I not paying that increased rate, but my mortgage didn't go up.
Right.
So the percentage of if wages somewhat keep up with it, the percentage of my income that goes to paying off my mortgage payment or my car is reduced, and now I have more disposable income.
Right, because the supply of money is increasing, which is going to make the value of the dollar go down. Right. So with this increased money supply, the value of your debt also goes down theoretically.
Right.
I'm not an economist by any means. To be honest with you, a lot of it makes me scratch my head sometimes and think, why is it that way? But the overall purpose of the Populist Party's bimetallism concept was to increase inflation to knock down debt.
Right.
And debt directly related back to those monopolistic grain transport.
Right, and farmers are really dealing with some debt.
Yeah.
Now, their original goal was bimetallism, right? And of course, William Jennings Bryan is kind of their champion for it, right? That's where you get that cross of gold speech.
Yeah.
You shall not crucify mankind on the cross of gold, you know. But the ultimate goal is greenbacks. It used to be the dollar was backed by gold. You could actually go and take your dollar bills and exchange them for gold. What they want is greenbacks, which are money just printed. It's not necessarily backed by anything. That's what we have today, right? And it allows for, theoretically, unlimited inflation, right? You can print as much money as you want and inflate money to the high heavens. And, of course, their champion for it is the great orator. He goes around and gives all these speeches, is this William Jennings Bryan. And he's going to give all these speeches, but he's still going to lose. In fact, he's going to lose to a guy that basically doesn't even campaign. He just kind of sits in his bunker and hides out, right? But the key to it is, and this is one of those where I used to ask my students, would you be okay if you're, because he never touches the presidency.
No.
But everything he runs for, he gets. Right? He never wins presidency, but he ends up, you know, today we have direct election of senators. Today we have greenbacks. Today we have direct ballot voting. Everything he fought for, we get. He's just not the one that gives it to us.
Right.
But he's the one that sets all those wheels in motion.
Yeah. About this specific cartoon, because this is a pretty famous cartoon. A lot of people
could see on the
it's quite possible. I love William Jennings Bryan. I give my students the saying WWWJB. What would William Jennings Bryan do?
Yeah.
About this particular cartoon, this was created by his opponents to slow down his speed towards the election. Okay. Their big issue with William Jennings Bryan was that he used Christian imagery in his Cross of Gold speech.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can see the cartoon has him holding a crown of thorns and a cross, kind of like Jesus, which is why the speech is ultimately called the Cross of Gold, as he says at the end, "You will not crucify me upon this cross of gold." But yeah, as he was saying, he does eventually everything that goes on or that he champions for or kind of runs for eventually gets passed. So he was a little bit ahead of his time, quote unquote. As far as that goes. But yeah, doesn't he end up getting in a cabinet later on? Doesn't he end up getting in someone's cabinet?
Oh yeah, he ends up becoming a Secretary of State.
He ends up becoming a Secretary of State.
Maybe even Attorney General too.
Okay.
Okay, so shifting out of that, we're going to shift into U.S. foreign policy, right? Now, why am I showing an image of George Washington? Ever since the United States had been formed, George Washington, there was talks of even making him king, right? And one of the things he didn't want to be in a position where he was kind of seen as the heir apparent to King George, right? Yeah. So he wants to make sure he steps down. And on his way out, he gives his famous farewell address. And of course, the chief sentiment behind this farewell address is not to have any entangled alliances with any foreign countries, right? So begins this era of what we refer to as U.S. isolationism, right? We stay out of everybody's businesses. We worry about our own. And it's not just self-serving in the fact that we don't want to get caught up in other people's wars. There's the aspect, too, of can we get caught up in other people's wars?
Do we have the facilities?
Yeah, we really may or may not even have the means of doing that. We don't have a formal military.
Right.
So that's something else George Washington was worried about, of us getting sucked into another war and making America vulnerable to foreign invasion. And so that's going to really set the tone for U.S. foreign policy.
Right, we really listened to him, didn't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. He also advised against political parties, too, so... There's that.
Well, our first departure from this is going to happen in 1823, and that is with the Monroe Doctrine. Of course, this is from President Monroe. And he kind of asserts that, okay, we're going to stay out of other countries' affairs, except Latin America, right? We call dibs on Latin America, right? So he's kind of doing that. He's looking at Europe and he's saying, hey, you stay in your lane, we'll stay in ours. We got this.
This was particularly aimed at Great Britain. Great Britain goes on a colonization streak in the 19th and 20th century. And I think their last colony was India, if I remember correctly. And that ended up finally being turned over, I think, in what, the 50s?
Yeah, with the Raj.
The 50s? Yeah, so this is mainly aimed at Britain, but it's aimed at the Eastern Hemisphere as a whole.
Yeah, you stay out of the Americas.
Yes.
We got those,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So that's going to be the first major departure of the Washington sentiment. Okay, the next one is we're going to start choosing to carve up China. Now, we do work with Europe to do this, and we start carving up China in what we refer to as spheres of influence, right? So, we get this chunk of land, France, you may get this chunk, Germany get this chunk, and we, America, really take center stage in deciding who gets what chunk of China.
Yeah. The whole idea behind it, was that they wanted to be involved in the foreign market of China. There were a lot of goods that were coming out of China that were very expensive and very rare, if I remember correctly. So they wanted to be involved in the foreign market, but they didn't want other people stepping on their territory, quote unquote.
Right. Of course, you can guess who they did not invite to these meetings, and that was the Chinese people.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
The Chinese government is not invited to this meeting, right? Okay. So that's our next big departure. The following big departure we have is going to see this guy named Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt's an interesting character. He's kind of an adventure junkie, if you will. He's almost like a self-righteous, he believes he's doing the right thing kind of guy, and he can't be bought or sold. And he's going to kind of get us involved in a war to try to free Cuba with the Spanish-American War. And this is really a war that we start simply so he can fight in it. He's way past his prime to be fighting in the front lines. And for an officer of his caliber, right, this admiral guy, for him to be out in the front lines is absolutely unheard of.
It's a little crazy.
But he does. He gets his band together, the Rough Riders.
Yes. The most... Because I was doing some research on this earlier. Their claim to fame as the Rough Riders, quote unquote.
By the way, here's Teddy Roosevelt right here.
Yeah.
And these Rough Riders are the hand-picked best of the best.
If you couldn't tell by the egregious mustache. The claim to fame for the Rough Riders is they formed a constricting ring around the city of Santiago in Cuba, which was one of the key points in helping the United States win the war. But I do think he kind of, as Mr. Waldrop was mentioning, this is an old guy. He's not like 23, 24 getting out there and running with the young cats. He's pretty old at this point. And I think it is a little bit self-serving, but... just remember from this the Rough Riders and their role in the Spanish-American War.
Right. So the next big one is going to happen also under Teddy Roosevelt, and that is going to be us with the Philippines. That's a very fascinating one. See, the Philippines had been controlled by the Spanish, and they were known for their infamous navy, right, the Spanish Armada. And so we set sail with 9 ships out of Hong Kong. And our boys are basically talking to the Hong Kong government, and they, had kind of gotten to be friends with them. They think they're going off to get wiped out, right? It's like 9 ships versus 200. The only guy that dies is a guy that dies of heat stroke on the way over there. It's very much kind of like the USS Kidd type modern-day battleships versus Jack Sparrow style, old-timey wooden cabin ships. Of course, they light up like lighter fluid when you hit them with the big, heavy cannons. And, it's kind of, I used to joke with my students, which would you rather have, an iPhone 12 or 12 iPhone 2s? It doesn't add up that way, right? So, it's one of those situations where the newer is better situation. We helped free the Philippines... And they're all celebrating like, yay, we're done with the Spanish. And we're like,
you ain't done with us.
Yeah, you're done with the Spanish, but you ain't done with being colonized. Now you belong to us.
Right.
And so the Philippines become a colony of the United States. And that's just the first example of us just annexing territory. Of course, this is another image you could see of, the American eagle kind of putting its shadow of influence over the Philippines. You can also see his other foot's going to start to creep into Panama. And so that's the kind of next advancement in U.S. interventionism. Meanwhile, back at home, that populist movement is going to give rise to an economic movement. Mm-hmm. We've talked about all these fat cats, these robber barons, and they're really starting to squeeze the little guy. Of course, we call this the Gilded Age. Mm-hmm. And you're going to start to see people push back. Oh, by the way, it is entirely possible you see this image. You could see maybe something like this image. And then possibly one of these two images on the leap test. You probably won't see this one on there. Coming out of this same progressive era comes a guy named Jacob Riis. Now, he's got a lot of photos. You could see possibly this one, but if you're in class, in Mr. Ray's class, you've probably seen quite a few of these images. Mm-hmm. I've actually been here. It's kind of
another cool. One is the kids in the alley.
Yeah, kids in the alley.
They're all sitting there together.
Right.
There was, I think, if I remember correctly, on the PowerPoint that I gave them, there was like 6 or 7 of them. And I'll be sure to go back and find those images and get them to you
guys. Of course, this is, of course, a New York tenement house. Mm-hmm. By the way, if you go to New York, you can do the Jacob Riis tour, right? Wow. You see these. I've seen the alleyway and all that stuff. It's really cool. It doesn't look the same anymore. But
of course not.
Of course, you can see a lot of people crammed together. It's funny, Teddy Roosevelt will say Jacob Riis was the greatest American he ever
worked with,
even though he was a German immigrant, right? But he kind of lived this American dream, right? This guy that came over with nothing and made himself as a photojournalist and really shaped how Teddy Roosevelt saw how to treat people at home and fight for the working class. And so Teddy Roosevelt is going to kind of become what we refer to as a trust buster, right? He's going to start eating up these railroad monopoly guys. Any of these images are on the menu, right? But he's going to start putting the clamp down and really putting the squeeze to these robber barons. And they're going to start kind of referring to him almost as a king. And he's kind of really wielding the power like that, right? You see, we have things on the books like the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act that makes having a monopoly illegal. A lot of companies in recent history have kind of skirted that and done a lot of legal trickery to be able to pull it off. One of the ones I always joke with students about is, who in here has a phone that doesn't use the Android or Apple iOS operating systems, and it's like sometimes it'd be like Google's got their own or something like that.
I saw a video the other day, and there is a total of 12 brands that stock grocery stores. They own multiple products. They own multiple products that are branded different, but it's all owned by the same parent company.
Almost everybody you know is either AT&T, Verizon, or T-Mobile.
Or T-Mobile.
And AT&T almost bought T-Mobile.
Correct.
And you may go like myself. I would say, well, I use Mint Mobile.
Yeah, well, it's a subsidiary.
Yeah, it's owned by T-Mobile. You're still using T-Mobile. You don't know it. But I think Cricket is owned by Verizon. I forget which one Boost is owned by. But you're owned by one of the 3 big dogs.
Correct.
And he kind of, the reason they said he was a kingmaker is, if you were playing by the rules and treating your workers fairly, he just kind of left you alone.
Yeah.
But if you were not doing well by the workers, he didn't care who you were. He was one of those guys, like, you're not going to buy him off. So he's kind of seen as like a kingmaker.
Yeah.
And another one that kind of drives his policy, that really kind of gets him to go after, I think they read it in your class, I know they read it in mine,
they did.
Excerpts from the Jungle.
Yeah,
and that's where somebody goes into a Chicago.
That gets a very volatile reaction.
Yeah. It's usually one of the ones that students really remember.
If you don't remember, it's the one about the meat plant where the guy falls in the vat of acid and all that other stuff.
Yeah, they're eating rat poo.
Yeah, it's quite a read.
Pickled meat from 2 months ago just gets thrown in.
Quite a read.
Yeah, it kind of gives you the evidence of. Whenever somebody's like, why do we have to have an FDA? This is why we have to
Exactly.
have an FDA.
I think it actually...
This is what it was before we had an FDA.
It's actually followed up with the Meat Inspection Act.
That's right.
And I think one of the cartoons that is coming up next is Teddy Roosevelt. There we go, that one.
Yeah.
Teddy Roosevelt holding his nose.
The muckraker.
Yeah. It's a bad job, and I think the name of the cartoon is A Nauseating Job. It's a bad job, but somebody's got to do it, and the whole idea behind it is that the federal government should be more involved with keeping people in poverty closer or farther away from that poverty line, right? A lot of people coming up with this political idea that the federal government should be involved in the everyday working lives of American citizens, especially in the realm of reform.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that might be a pretty important cartoon to take a look at there.
And it could be on the test.
Right, absolutely.
Absolutely. Following in the sentiment of U.S. abandoning isolationism, Teddy Roosevelt is going to start, he's got this new naval fleet with the best and brightest and, the best of the best ships on the planet. And he's really going to want to start using it, right? You see he's got a stick, it's called Big Stick, and this kind of represents his big stick diplomacy. This is another one you could see, right? Where, his expressions speak softly but carry a big stick. And you can see he's working for U.S. business interests, and he's starting to kind of police the world, at least in Latin America. Now, following on that is going to be, this is Taft, his vice president.
Yes, William Taft.
And Taft is going to come along, and he's going to create dollar diplomacy. And dollar diplomacy is this idea of any investment made in Latin America, we will back, right? With our military force if need be.
Yeah, I think the name of that cartoon is so funny. It's the pen is mightier than the stick, and it's a play on words on the a pen is mightier than the sword thing, where William Howard Taft's policies were allegedly more peaceful, quote unquote, than Teddy Roosevelt's, but for all intents and purposes, dollar diplomacy kind of flops. For all intents and purposes, it doesn't really make it out of his presidency.
Right. Okay. So we've kind of done some radical departures. By the way, I don't know who Bad Girl Riri is, but thank you for joining us. But out of that starts coming some radical departures of U.S. isolationism. Leading up to that, Europe is starting to have some problems. You're probably not going to see this image, but you can see one like it. And that is, there's the perfect set of circumstances for some really messiness to happen. You see, we call this the powder keg, by the way. And it all begins with entangled alliances, right? This is kind of the arms race of the era, if you will, where everybody's trying to have the biggest and best possible giant alliance that they can possibly have to really protect themselves from other major alliances, right? The problem is when one of them gets sucked into war, they all get sucked into war. They all have to go.
Yeah, right. That's why this graphic organizer or this Venn diagram is extremely confusing, because you've got all of these, as Mr. Waldrop was calling it, entangled alliances. You've got everything kind of converging on two countries, it's Serbia and Bulgaria. They have a little bit of an issue in Serbia. Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated, and at that point, Germany declares war. Okay? Once that happens, everything is about to start getting sucked in, and you'll see by this cartoon, it starts off, if you touch me, I'll blank. If you make a move, I'll blank. If you hit that little feller, I'll blank. If you strike my friend, I'll blank. I showed this one in class. And this cartoon is really a good way to illustrate the entangled alliances concept through political cartoons. Because it's dragging in all these different people of different nationalities, and you can tell by the way that they're dressed. That's just a map of the different alliances that kind of pop up at this time period. League of Nations, yeah. The issue with the League of Nations is that, Woodrow Wilson goes out and has all these grand ideas on how the League of Nations should be run and this and that. We never actually join.
Yeah, it happens, but we ain't part of it.
We never
and our worry is that it's going to have our hands tied behind our back.
Yes.
That we're going to get sucked in one of these entangled alliances.
Yes. And, that's why Uncle Sam's got all his hands tied up, and you'll see on the right-hand side it's got European nations, on the left-hand side it's got foreign nations, and then I think that guy over there on the front left is England, and then on the right-hand side it's the Empire of Japan. Everybody's kind of holding Uncle Sam down from doing what Uncle Sam needs to do, quote-unquote.
So, Germany is going to strike first, and what's going to happen is, to go back to these entangled alliances, we got heavy militarism. All these countries are heavily building up their military. They're all in these alliances. All of them want to go out and expand their land, right? We're not that far removed from, like, the Roman Empire, the Persians, or blah, blah, blah. Like, that's what big countries do in this era. They expand. And all of them think their country is the greatest.
It's kind of like a match for match. Oh, well, you have a navy this big? Well, I'm going to build my navy a little bit bigger than yours, just to kind of stay in competition.
So, this Archduke Ferdinand gets assassinated. And it's going to kick everything into gear, right? Because it's going to trigger all these alliances where, the Serbians kill this Archduke, Austria-Hungary gets sucked into war, and then all their allies get sucked in, and all Serbia's allies get sucked in. Next thing you know, we're going to war. When war kicks off, the Germans have a new gun called Big Bertha. And this is Big Bertha. And it's this radical new invention in technology. It's the most powerful gun ever built. And it is a gun that's firing so far, you have to account for the curvature of the earth.
I told my students in class, the range on that gun is like you could put it at Denham Springs High School, and it would hit Lafayette on a pinpoint.
Yeah.
Right? Like you could kind of target it a little bit, but it would hit Lafayette, and it would go that far.
It's funny, I was always telling my story to the students. So France invests in these lightweight cannons, right? They're not nearly as powerful, but they're faster. They can go about 50
I called them baby cannons in class.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it creates this really neat standoff where the Germans show up, the French show up, and they think, "Oh, well, let's have our little kind of standoff." And Germany shows up, and they've only got 3 cannons. France got about 250, and they're like, "All right, are we going to do this or what?" And they could see the cannons off in the distance with their telescopes. And then they start hearing the explosions. And they're like, "What is that? Sounds like thunder." And next thing you know, chaos is ensuing and body parts are flying everywhere. The French generals are telling them to charge. And the French soldiers are like, "No, we're not charging that. Have you seen this cannon?" I used to make the example at the school I was at last time. They had buildings that were, about 300-400 feet away from each other. And I said, "Look, the French cannon, if they shot it, it'd be like Jack Sparrow's cannon. It'll come in, it'll bust through our window, it'll kill a few people, it'll be fine. This cannon is shooting a cannonball that is doing about 2,000 miles an hour, and when it hits the building, the whole building explodes.
It can completely level it, yeah.
The building is the size of a car.
Correct.
I mean, the bullet is the size of a car. And so it's just a much more powerful gun. It's really the difference maker on the front lines until the Allies decide to dig in. Right? So France is pretty much taken, and the Allied forces decide they're going to start digging trenches. And thus begins trench warfare.
Which becomes the primary method of combat during this time period.
Yeah, it's the ultimate defense. Right? And it creates this hellish hellscape environment. I used to tell people, if you could pick one environment you don't want to be in, it's the trench in World War I.
Yeah,
right?
It's gross.
There's dead body juice everywhere.
Gross.
People are
it fills up with water and floods. And people get trench foot and trench mouth.
They get sick. There's no food to speak of. We don't understand PTSD. People are getting shell shocked, is what they call it, killing themselves. It is the closest thing to hell on earth I can think of. And then you get to wear gas masks all day, every day, out of fear of
the rise of
chemical warfare, right? Mustard gas, right? And coming out of that, we're eventually going to have, in the middle of the war, Russia's going to drop out with the communist revolution, Vladimir Lenin. And of course, that's going to be a problem where England and France are now pretty much on their own. Germany is pretty much their only recourse on their own, and so it creates this kind of like stalemate. Until eventually America gets involved, right? So it's going to begin with unrestricted submarine warfare. This image could be on the test. There's several like it. But they're going to sink a passenger ship called the Lusitania. Now, it's very loosely a passenger ship. It's secretly carrying weapons.
It's carrying weapons and ammunition.
We're trying to make a little coin off this thing, right?
It's a cargo ship for all intents and purposes.
But it gets sunk, and you start hearing people say, remember the Lusitania.
Mm.
And, of course, this is part of their unrestricted submarine warfare.
Mm.
They'll sink anything. Cruise ships, passenger ships, they don't care.
It don't matter. If it floats, it sinks.
Then comes the famous Zimmerman telegraph. This is a good one to keep an eye out for.
Yes.
Where we basically intercept the message where Germany is trying to talk Mexico into saying, hey, if you attack the U.S. and keep them off our backs, when we're done with England and France, we'll come over there and help you, and we'll give you back your old land.
Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona.
Right.
It's kind of like an under-the-table deal, too. The only reason we got it was because British intelligence intercepted it and then sent it over to us. It's more of a nudge-nudge, wink-wink kind of thing. The Germans thought they were slick, I guess. Is that the saying you want to
I guess so.
They thought they were slick. But, we end up intercepting that telegram, and along with the Lusitania, we end up getting involved in World War I.
Right. Okay, so following that, it gets to be kind of a stalemate, but when Germany realizes the U.S. is about to enter, I used to make the analogy, it'd be like two prize fighters, and they've been fighting. Mm-hmm. Either one could go at any moment, and then all of a sudden one of them tags out, and Mike Tyson enters, or Evander Holyfield, or something like that. And it's like, well, guy, now you got a fresh guy coming in. How am I supposed to beat this guy, right?
Right.
So Germany gives up, but it begins this problem that, throughout history, when you surrender, you lay down your weapons.
Mm-hmm.
Germany's allowed to go home with their weapons in hand. And they think, okay, we must have had some kind of draw, or if we surrendered, it was a conditional surrender.
Mm-hmm.
They thought they were going home with their heads held high.
Did they even really surrender, technically? Yeah.
Thus begins what most people refer to as the Jewish myth, which we're going to talk about in just a second.
The stab in the back.
Meanwhile, back home, in the United States, we have the 14-point plan. And this is Teddy Roosevelt's idea for how to handle a not Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson plan for how to handle a post-World War I world, right? The problem is he has all these big ideas, right? Like not heavy war reparations, which is like giving this giant unpayable bill to Germany, and creating this League of Nations, right? So he begins touring and selling. Now, he sold it in Europe. Mm-hmm. He's got to sell it at home. He's got to get America to sign off on his plan. Mm-hmm. He begins touring the United States to sell his plan. It's working. And he begins having a series of strokes. As he has these series of strokes, he cannot continue touring. In the United States, it fails. They're still under that Washington isolationism. And they decide, hey, we can't do this. And it fails. And so there's a League of Nations. We're not in it. And they go ahead and go forth with war reparations.
Right. Which we're going to talk about in a second is the quintessential cause of World War II. We'll talk about that in a second, though.
Right.
The 14-point plan was essentially a way to rebuild Europe after World War I, because in the next following couple of images, we'll see Europe looked pretty bad after World War I. It looked extremely rough. And Woodrow Wilson wanted to find a way to rebuild Europe while at the same time not recreating the same problem that they had with World War I.
Right. Now, meanwhile, back in Germany, it is really bad, right? Things are getting rough. And it's getting to be a situation where the average person is starving in the streets. I mean, all their cities are in crumbles and ruins and so on and so forth. It's getting really rough. And that's going to kind of set the tone for, the Germans are a proud people. They thought they went home with their heads held high. They still had their weapons. Meanwhile, the rest of Europe is kind of deciding their fate. This is the Big Four, led by Woodrow Wilson over here on the right. It's starting to be absolute pandemonium in Europe, particularly, in Germany. Things are starting to really suffer. You're going to see the Jewish myth come in, and it's going to give rise to World War II. Okay, so this is going to do it for the first half of our... We're going to do a couple-part series we're gonna try doing it 2. Maybe we'll do it in 3.
Mm-hmm.
On the Leap review, this is part 1. So we're probably gonna what do you do it tomorrow?
Yeah, for all intents and purposes. After school tomorrow, I am doing a review for excuse me, I'm sorry. It's late and I haven't slept much. We're going to do a review for Korea to the present.
Okay.
If you haven't made it out to the couple of other sessions, I would highly advise you to come to this one. A lot of the teachers, by the time we get to the 80s and 90s, we are scrambling around to get you all the information you need. So please come out after school tomorrow. I will post this on Google Classroom for all of you to look at. Feel free to share the link with your friends. It's going to be on Mr. Waldrop's channel. I think it's just Jacob Waldrop, right? Or is it?
It's Waldrop
and Knowledge.
Yes,
okay,
yes,
all right.
Yes.
So I'm going to post this link on Google Classroom. Feel free to share this link with your friends. We will film episode 2 tomorrow. I think tomorrow we're going to do World War II and I guess the beginning of the Cold War because it's a lot. Especially World War II is a lot. So we'll do World War II tomorrow, and we'll do kind of the roots of the Cold War, and then on Thursday, we'll do Cold War to present.
Yeah, Friday we got D&D. So
yeah, we do. We can't do it Friday. Sorry, folks.
Yeah, sorry.
But by the time Thursday rolls around, you should have all the review materials you need. If you have any questions at all about anything that you listened to today, or the after-school review tomorrow, or the reviews with me and Mr. Waldrop on Wednesday and Thursday, feel free to come talk to either one of us. I always tell people he's kind of like my master Miyagi, so this guy knows it back and forth. Like the
like and subscribe, by the way.
Yeah, like and subscribe. Don't forget to hit the notification.
Yeah.
So have a wonderful evening, morning, afternoon, whatever time you're watching this, and I appreciate you for tuning in. Good luck on your LEAP test. We're going to pass.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Ray, for doing this.
Oh, anytime. Thank you.
It's been fun, and I look forward to seeing y'all tomorrow as we finish this up. So
all right.
Have a great evening.